Ed Sheeran was booked as the final guest of the night on The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon, and fans were already buzzing hours before the episode even aired. The singer-songwriter had recently wrapped up the international leg of his world tour and was expected to debut a new acoustic performance. Jimmy Fallon was excited too, as Ed was always one of his most charming and easygoing guests. No one watching, whether in the studio or at home, imagined the episode would escalate into one of the most shocking moments in late-night TV history. The interview began just like any other, with Jimmy cracking jokes and Ed smiling politely as the audience cheered. They talked about touring, writing music on the road, and the emotional process behind his newest album. Ed opened up about his writing style, saying that fame had taught him to hold certain things close. Jimmy, known for his playful humor, poked fun in light-hearted ways, which usually worked well with Ed. But as the interview progressed, the tone slowly shifted from friendly banter to tension that few noticed at first. Things took a turn when Jimmy brought up rumors circulating online about Ed's personal life and career struggles. Ed tried to respond respectfully, but it was clear that he wasn't comfortable. He gently pushed back, saying certain topics were better kept private. Jimmy, however, seemed determined to get a viral moment. He pushed again, trying to turn the rumors into a comedic bit. Ed's expression changed, and the audience, sensing discomfort, fell into a rare silence. This wasn't the usual cheerful exchange they expected between the two stars. Jimmy then pulled out a segment titled Uncomfortable Questions, something the production team had planned as a surprise. Ed, clearly blindsided, hesitated. The audience chuckled nervously, assuming it was all part of the act, but Ed's reaction was different. As Jimmy read the first question aloud, a deeply personal one, Ed leaned back, visibly irritated. He answered carefully, reminding Jimmy that just because something is public doesn't mean it's fair game. But Jimmy laughed it off, thinking Ed was just playing along, not realizing he had just crossed a boundary. Trying to maintain professionalism, Ed shifted the conversation toward music again, but Jimmy interrupted to continue the segment. He joked about controversies and tabloids, pressing Ed for answers. Fans watching from home could feel the mood change, and social media began reacting instantly. Ed took a long pause, and for the first time in the interview, he stopped smiling. "I'm here to talk about the album, not to relive stuff that wasn't meant for TV," he said calmly, but his voice carried frustration that even the studio audience could hear. Jimmy, still assuming everything was fine, attempted to joke his way out, but Ed's patience was wearing thin. What was supposed to be a light moment had turned into a public interrogation. Ed reminded Jimmy that he had always shown respect when invited on the show, and he expected the same in return. But Jimmy, desperate for laughs, made one more sarcastic comment that pushed things too far. Ed stared at him, took a deep breath, and the silence that filled the studio was enough to stop everything in its tracks. "You know what, I don't need to do this," Ed finally said, and the crowd gasped. Jimmy looked stunned as Ed set down his mic and stood up. The producers were frozen, unsure whether it was a bit or a genuine walk-off. Ed turned toward the audience, gave a small nod, and walked off stage without another word. The cheers, laughter, and applause were gone, replaced by collective shock. That moment became one of the most unforgettable walk-offs in late-night history, and no one could believe it had just happened live. Jimmy tried to recover, still half laughing as if it might be a joke, but it was quickly clear Ed was not coming back. "Well, a broken bar that didn't go how I thought it would," Jimmy said awkwardly, trying to play off the moment. The show cut to an emergency commercial break while producers scrambled backstage to figure out what to do next. Fans at home were already tweeting non-stop, and within minutes, #Ed Sheeran walks off started trending globally. Clips of the moment spread like wildfire, creating instant headlines across entertainment media. Backstage, Ed remained composed but firm. His team stood by him, confirming to staff that the interview had crossed lines that should never have been crossed. Multiple witnesses said Ed expressed disappointment rather than anger, saying he expected more respect from someone he considered a friend. The walk-off wasn't planned or scripted, it was a response driven by real frustration, and that authenticity is what ignited the internet in a way that no staged moment ever could. Jimmy Fallon's production team immediately began damage control, trying to contact Ed's team to see if he would return to at least perform, but Ed's response was clear. He wasn't performing tonight. The cameras rolled again, and Jimmy gave a brief explanation, claiming that things had gone unexpectedly and that he hoped there were no hard feelings. But fans weren't convinced, and many criticized Jimmy for pushing too hard. Others defended him, calling it part of the late-night format. But one thing was certain: nothing about that moment felt funny. By the next morning, the story was everywhere. Major entertainment sites, radio shows, YouTube channels, and podcasts were dissecting every second of the interview. Expert body language readers were analyzing Ed's reactions. Fans debated online whether his walk-off was justified. Some said celebrities should expect personal questions. Others argued that lines should never be crossed, whether on live television or not. The incident sparked a global discussion about boundaries and respect in celebrity interviews. Ed remained publicly silent for a couple of days, which only fueled curiosity. Meanwhile, Jimmy issued a statement during the following episode, saying he respected Ed and never meant to make him uncomfortable. He cracked a light joke about learning the hard way that some jokes aren't funny, but viewers sensed the tension behind his forced humor. It was clear that the fallout had affected both his reputation and the show's credibility, forcing them to reconsider their entire interview structure. Finally, Ed broke his silence with a thoughtful Instagram post. He didn't attack Jimmy or the show. He simply explained that he believed in protecting energy, peace, and privacy, especially while dealing with deeply personal life moments. "I love late-night TV," he wrote, "but not at the cost of my dignity." Fans praised him for the classy response, and the post quickly gained millions of interactions. Ed's calm approach only elevated him further in the eyes of the public. Behind the scenes, NBC executives held internal meetings to discuss how the situation could have been handled better. Some staff members privately admitted that the whole segment was designed to spark a reaction, hoping to create a viral moment. Instead, they got a PR nightmare. Talk shows across the industry began quietly adjusting their interview policies. Producers were warned not to prioritize shock value over respect as something they previously dismissed in pursuit of ratings. Ed's walk-off also inspired other artists to speak publicly about their own uncomfortable interview experiences. Well-known musicians, actors, and comedians shared stories of times they felt cornered, mocked, or exploited for ratings. Social media users pointed out a pattern: celebrities were constantly being pushed into discussing trauma, relationships, or controversies they clearly wanted to avoid. Ed's actions sparked a wave of support for healthier boundaries between artists and the media. While many viewers initially assumed the moment would eventually blow over, it only grew larger. Blogs, podcasts, and entertainment panels debated whether Ed's reaction was justified or overly dramatic. But those who had watched the unedited footage noticed how gradually his discomfort intensified. It wasn't an overreaction, it was a breaking point. The raw clip, replayed millions of times, showed a man trying repeatedly to steer the conversation back to positivity, only to be ignored. The incident also ignited conversations within fan communities who had defended Jimmy Fallon for years, insisting his interviews were kinder than other late-night hosts. Some argued that he had simply misjudged the situation. Others said the moment proved that even the most cheerful personalities can cross lines when chasing ratings. In think pieces and commentary videos, the phrase "Ed handled it better than most" became a recurring theme as fans admired his composure under pressure. Meanwhile, Ed's upcoming album pre-orders skyrocketed. Fans rallied behind him, praising him for showing emotional boundaries and refusing to entertain invasive questions. The walk-off, instead of hurting his career, reminded people why they connected to him in the first place via authenticity. Music journalists noted that Ed never relied on drama or controversy to sell records. His songs told real stories, and now his actions offstage proved he practiced what he preached. At the same time, late-night television itself faced criticism. Viewers began calling out the industry's shift toward viral moments instead of meaningful interviews. Many pointed out that artists were often treated as clickbait rather than guests. Some worried this trend would ruin the trust between artists and TV hosts. The phrase "respect the artist" began trending as people shared other examples of invasive interviews that pushed guests to emotional limits. Jimmy Fallon eventually reached out to Ed privately with an apology that was described as sincere and heartfelt by insiders. The two had a long-standing friendly relationship off-camera, which made the fallout even more surprising. Although the public didn't know the details, sources claimed the conversation was respectful and productive. But even with the apology, the damage was done. Audiences now viewed the show differently, and Jimmy had to rebuild trust on air. Weeks later, it appeared in a radio interview, and without naming Jimmy, he discussed why the moment mattered. He said, "There's a difference between asking tough questions and ignoring someone's boundaries." He talked about mental health, fame, and how artists need safe spaces to express themselves. The radio host thanked him for being open, and for the first time since the incident, Ed smiled while talking about it, suggesting he had found peace in speaking his truth. His fans were thrilled that he had moved on so gracefully. On TikTok, users began posting edits of the walk-off alongside his song lyrics, calling him an example of self-respect. Music critics said the moment, though dramatic, would likely be remembered as a turning point in how celebrity interviews were conducted. Younger artists even publicly thanked Ed for making it acceptable to set boundaries without feeling guilty or difficult. Over on The Tonight Show, Jimmy began changing the interview structure in small but noticeable ways. Guests were now informed about certain segments ahead of time. Producers avoided surprise topics involving trauma or scandals. Jimmy himself took on a more careful tone, often asking permission before diving into sensitive subjects. Viewers noticed the shift, and although some found the new tone less unpredictable, many saw it as a necessary evolution. Months passed, and the story was still brought up occasionally by fans and media figures. It became a reference point whenever a celebrity refused to answer a question or shut down a conversation. People joked, "Are we having an Ed Sheeran moment?" The walk-off had become part of pop culture language, symbolizing the moment someone chose dignity over television drama. Ed never bragged about it or used it for publicity, which only earned him more respect. Behind closed doors, industry insiders agreed that Ed had changed the game. Television hosts and interviewers began reviewing boundaries and ethics in media training sessions. Publicists felt empowered to speak up for their clients. Some suggested that celebrities should be allowed to approve questions before interviews, an idea that used to be considered too demanding. Ed's walk-off had sparked change even among people who had never worked with him directly. Ed's next appearance on a talk show wasn't until a year later, and fans held their breath waiting to see how he would handle it. The host greeted him warmly, acknowledged the past respectfully, and allowed Ed to set his own tone for the conversation. The interview went beautifully. Ed performed, laughed, and shared meaningful stories. When asked how he felt returning to TV, he smiled and said, "Good. It feels like people actually listened." Even Jimmy Fallon eventually touched on the story again in an interview of his own, admitting that he learned a valuable lesson. He stated that he never wanted to make someone feel embarrassed or cornered, and that the incident opened his eyes to how quickly a joke can turn into disrespect. Though some critics thought the apology came too late, others said accountability should always be acknowledged. At the very least, it showed that the moment wasn't taken lightly. Today, the walk-off remains one of the most discussed and debated moments in modern talk show history. It is replayed in compilation videos, cited in media ethics classes, and referenced in social media discourse. Fans look back not just at what happened, but why it mattered. The moment wasn't about drama, it was about respect, boundaries, and self-worth. And for many, Ed Sheeran walking off that stage wasn't a meltdown. It was a message. What could have been just another interview became a cultural flashpoint, and for Ed, the story became part of his legacy, not because he stormed out in anger, but because he walked away with grace. He reminded the world that the most powerful move isn't always to argue or defend yourself, it's sometimes to simply walk away. That decision resonated with millions, especially those who have felt pressured to endure uncomfortable situations for the sake of politeness or reputation. In the end, both Ed Sheeran and Jimmy Fallon moved forward in their careers, but the moment served as a lasting reminder to everyone watching: respect is not optional. Conversations matter, vulnerability matters, and the intent behind every question matters, whether in entertainment or everyday life. The incident showed that emotional boundaries are valid and worth protecting, and that single quiet moment when Ed set down his mic and walked away will be remembered long after the cameras stopped rolling. As time went on, the conversation around the walk-off evolved from viral buzz to a meaningful cultural reference. Fans, journalists, and even psychologists continued to analyze why the moment struck such a powerful chord. Some said it was because Ed represented a generation unwilling to tolerate invasive behavior disguised as humor. Others believed it highlighted the imbalance of power between artists and networks. Whatever the reason, it became bigger than just a celebrity incident. People began sharing their own stories online, comparing Ed's exit to moments when they too had walked away from uncomfortable conversations. Tweets, TikToks, and essays poured in from those who said they finally felt validated seeing someone refuse to tolerate disrespect, even in a high-pressure situation. The incident became symbolic not just for fans of Ed Sheeran, but for anyone who had ever been pushed past their emotional limit and chose peace instead of conflict. Despite the ongoing discussions, Ed refused to feed sensationalism. When asked repeatedly to spill more details or critique Jimmy directly, he declined every time. He said what mattered wasn't the drama, but the message. His refusal to turn the moment into a feud only strengthened the impact. Many celebrities would have capitalized on the attention, but Ed did the opposite. He quietly returned to making music, letting the world draw its own conclusions. Some insiders later revealed that Ed had been dealing with personal pressures long before the interview. Between a demanding tour schedule, family responsibilities, and media obligations, the incident simply came at the wrong moment. That perspective helped fans understand that even a calm person can reach a breaking point. Supporters praised him for responding with restraint, walking away instead of escalating a situation that could have turned ugly on national television. Meanwhile, Jimmy's team worked behind the scenes to prevent future backlash. Producers consulted guest teams more carefully, and staff training emphasized empathy over entertainment value. Other talk show hosts privately admitted that the entire industry had developed an unhealthy obsession with creating viral tension. Ed's walk-off forced them to reconsider whether shock value was worth damaging relationships with guests they claimed to celebrate. In interviews afterward, Ed spoke openly about the importance of mental health in the entertainment industry. He shared stories about burnout, pressure, and how even the most successful artists can feel trapped while smiling for cameras. Viewers appreciated his honesty. The moment became a rare instance where a dramatic event led to productive conversations about emotional well-being rather than scandal and gossip, and that shift was largely because Ed refused to turn it into a feud. There were also rumors that the clip was nearly withheld from broadcast. Some staff reportedly wanted to edit the walk-off out entirely and avoid controversy. However, executives decided to air it up partly because they believed transparency was better, and partly because they knew the clip would generate millions of views. Ironically, the network that triggered the moment also benefited from the drama, a fact that did not go unnoticed by critics. Even with the world talking, Ed maintained a quiet presence on social media. He posted no angry statements, no defensive threads, just music and messages of gratitude for his fans. That silence spoke volumes. It reminded people that true power doesn't always require shouting. Sometimes it's found in choosing not to engage. Ed's approach became a masterclass in handling controversy with grace rather than aggression. Fans later noticed that a lyric on one of Ed's new songs seemed to reference the incident. It wasn't explicit, but it hinted at walking away from toxicity, choosing self-worth, and refusing to perform for people who only want pain. Whether intentional or not, the lyric became iconic among fans who had followed the situation closely, interpreting it as poetic closure to a moment that had changed the way they saw him and the entertainment world. Meanwhile, Jimmy began making more efforts to show sincerity on air. He talked about respect, boundaries, and personal growth. Some viewers believed it was just damage control, while others felt he genuinely understood the impact of the moment. Regardless of perception, The shift was noticeable. Guests who once seemed tense on his show gradually became more relaxed, as if reassured they wouldn't be blindsided for a joke. Years from now, media students will likely study the Ed Sheeran walk-off the same way earlier generations studied iconic interview moments. It wasn't explosive, violent, or chaotic, yet it changed things. It proved that emotional discomfort can be just as powerful as outrage. It showed that silence, paired with action, can be the loudest protest. And it demonstrated that authenticity still has a place in a world built on performative entertainment. What initially looked like a moment of conflict was slowly recognized as an act of self-preservation. Viewers who once laughed at awkward interviews now began seeing the humanity behind them. Even critics who disliked Ed's music admitted that the walk-off earned their respect. The moment stood as a reminder that artists are not props, and that no amount of ratings should justify crossing personal lines for entertainment. As Ed continued touring, performing, and releasing new work, the incident faded from headlines but never disappeared completely. Fans still referenced it whenever he talked about respect or honesty. New audiences discovered the clip and reacted with fresh outrage. Each new wave of viewers saw the moment through their own lens, but they all agreed on one point: Ed didn't walk off to cause drama. He walked off because he deserved better. In the end, the clash between Ed Sheeran and Jimmy Fallon will be remembered less for conflict and more for its ripple effect. It inspired artists to advocate for themselves, encouraged fans to support boundaries, and pushed media professionals to rethink how they handled vulnerability. It wasn't a scandal, it was a turning point, driven by a single decision made in real time by an artist who chose peace over performance. If you watch the clip today, you might not see shouting or explosive anger. You'll see a quiet moment where Ed evaluates the situation, recognizes his limit, and stands up for his piece. It lasts only a few seconds, but those seconds changed everything. They became a symbol of courage wrapped in calmness. And long after the drama faded, that message remained: sometimes the most powerful thing you can do, broken bar, is simply walk away.